Good evening. Thank you so much for coming tonight. My name is Kate Link. I'm the Faculty Senate President, and we're going to do a brief welcoming and then kick off the program. Uh, this is supposed to be a live encounter, and it is, but not exactly as technically savvy as we had hoped because there's no internet and no telephone service on campus right now. So thank you to all of the technology folks for making this happen, and Parker for showing up in whatever form needed to happen in order to be part of this encounter. Just briefly to start out, I'll say, I think that as someone in higher education, this is one of the audiences for which Parker's work is so important. And one of the things Parker writes about in the Courage to Teach is the paradoxical tension between community and solitude, and how important it is that we hold these seemingly incommensurate ideas together to think through both our needs as scholars for solitude and renewal, or our needs for, as students, for time for ourselves to be in touch with our own inner knowing, but also our needs to move towards community. And one of the things he talks about is how oftentimes if we go too far in one direction to one pole or too far in the other, we can find different challenges in the educational experience. So too far into solitude without connection can lead to loneliness and isolation. And I think as faculty members, looking around at undergrad and graduate students, we see these issues in our educational system today. And too far towards connection can lead to a lack of connection to who we are and to that understanding of the intersection of who we are and what we do and how our work in the world can continue to be meaningful. So that's what I'm going to turn it over to the other co-planner for the evening, and then we will get started.
Thanks, Kate. So like Kate, I appreciate you all setting aside the time to participate in this event. It is the 20th anniversary of the book Courage to Teach. Hard to imagine it's been 20 years ago that the book was put out, and it's influenced generation upon generation of initially K-12 teachers, but it certainly has branched out into allied helping professions. And in particular, in addition to my role here as a faculty member, I have a great opportunity and blessing to work with physicians around wellness, of course, teachers in the K-12 world, and also members of the faith community. And most of the time when I'm working with them, excuse me, if I closed my eyes and scrubbed away the technical language, I would not be able to tell one community from the other. And this particular quote, and I would encourage you to try to figure out which of the communities it comes from, I think resonates with all of those communities and therefore speaks to the continuing impact and power of Parker's work from 20 years ago. But this one professional, in describing her sense of the professional landscape that she's working in, says that all the joy has been tested and legislated away, all that is left is sand and dust. And when all you're looking at is sand and dust, you're standing in that desert, an oasis looks very appealing. And I think the 20 years of that oasis of Courage to Teach as a book, as a concept, as a practice, has been a touch point for many, many professionals as they've crossed those desert landscapes. So what we're going to do, we're going to do right now, again, to further the live connection between us and you and Parker, is both Kate and I will read one of our favorite quotes from Courage to Teach, and then say a few things about it. And then from there, I'll transition into beginning to introduce the facilitator of the panel, and then we'll take it from there.
Parker writes, "Good teachers possess a capacity for connectedness. They are able to weave a complex web of connections among themselves, their subject, and their students, so that the students can learn to weave the world for themselves. As good teachers, weave the fabric that joins them and students and subjects. The heart is the loom on which the threads are tied. The tension is held, the shuttle flies, and the fabric is stretched tight. Small wonder that the teaching tugs at the heart, opens the heart, even breaks the heart. And the more one loves teaching, the more heartbreaking it can be. The courage to teach is the courage to keep one's heart open in those very moments when the heart is asked to hold more than it is able to. So the teacher and the student and the subject can be woven into the fabric of community that learning and living require. So for me, this does speak to a lot of what Parker's work speaks to, which is the heart of the teacher, but also the central role of connection, of relationship to ourselves, to each other, and to the world that is so much of the lifeblood of teaching and of higher education. And as we think about how we might bring his work to the University of Denver, to me, attending to the vitality of connectedness to ourselves, to the topic, to our students, and to the world that we live in is really important guidepost for thinking through not only issues that were in higher education 2 decades ago, but for the ones that we face today.
So Kate and I were joking, what would happen if we picked the same quote? we didn't. We didn't. I picked one, and it reads as this. We collaborate with structures of separation because they promise to protect us against one of the deepest fears at the heart of being human, the fear of having a live encounter with alien otherness, whether the other is a student, a colleague, a subject, or self-dissenting voice within. We fear encounters in which the other is free to be itself, to speak its own truth, to tell us what we may not wish to hear. We want those encounters on our own terms so that we can control their outcomes, so that they will not threaten our view of world and self. And for me, that's a powerful reminder of both, as an educator, the importance of inviting myself and students past those barriers of separation into that productive space of fear and uncertainty, as Brene Brown would call it, that space of courageous vulnerability, where I'm willing to show up fully in terms of who I am, both my strengths and my weaknesses, my foibles, as well as inviting my students to do the same thing. And it is a fear, I find, that is unfortunately, part of what most education is structured to be, that there is this inherent separation between the professor, the teacher, the one who has all the wisdom, and the students. And it's a constant challenge to push past that and not default into the role, into the structure, what it means to be a professor or a faculty member. Okay, so I would like at this point in time to introduce Diana Chapman Walsh, who will be the facilitator for this conversation. And just a few words about Diana to help situate her within the wider context. She's a good friend and a colleague of Parker, so they share that in common. Institutionally, she was the past president of Wellesley College, where she was president for 14 years. And in that role, she was well known nationally for her leadership style around reflective engagement, resilient partnership building, and the importance of leading from within in terms of building a productive community within higher ed. She's currently on the board of MIT and the Kaiser Family Foundation. And prior to all of that, she was a professor of the professor at the Public School of Public Health at Harvard, and then also at Boston University. And most importantly, perhaps for tonight's purposes, she wrote the preface to the 20th anniversary of Courage to Teach. So if you would join me in welcoming Diana.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul and Kate, for those words and the excerpts that you read, and for more than that, for making all of this come together and happen. We can't thank you enough. I want to take just a quick minute and find out what we're really facing here in terms of an interaction with Parker. I just have to tell you, so you have a sense of this. First of all, we are so grateful to the IT people at DU. They have worked so hard. And one and then another solution. And I think this is now running off of Josh's personal iPhone hotspot. And somehow he made that happen. And to Parker, too. So Parker, so I'm going to welcome you, but first I have to figure out, I see you over there and behind me, but are you seeing us? What is your experience? What are you seeing right now?
No, well, the first thing I want to say, Diana, is we've got to stop meeting like this.
Yeah, we do. That's for sure. Right. So there's a camera here. Are you looking at the panel?
No, I can't see you.
You can't.
I see a wall and half of a window in what may be the IT room or something like that.
Ah, okay.
I'm in a hotel room in New York
And
City where I'm attending a conference, and so it's lovely to hear your voice. It's lovely to hear from Paul and Kate, and I look forward to this. When I first got on, it looked like Tales from the Crypt.
Right. We're seeing you as through a glass darkly, and one of the interesting phenomena is because you had to turn up the lights around you, they're reflecting off your glasses. So it looks like you have very cool glasses on. And but it's amazing that they made this happen. When we first came in here, just so you all know, we came in a few hours ago and had dinner. They had these big jumbotron set up, and everything was ready to go, and it was going to be an intimate live encounter with Parker, and it was very exciting. But we will make this work because we have people who can make things like this work. There's a teaching poem that Parker likes to use. I think it's called Wild Geese. There are two called Wild Geese, and it ends up with the sentence, "What we need is here." So we are just going to believe that what we need is here. It may not be technologically quite up to snuff, but it's going to be adequate. So as Paul said, we're partly celebrating the 20th anniversary of Parker's landmark book, The Courage to Teach, and it was my great pleasure and privilege to write the foreword. Parker invited me to do that, and he said partly that way, picking up my copy. Everybody else has a completely dog-eared, no, not everybody, some have the new one. So he said we would have our names together on the cover, and we do, which is just such an amazing honor, and I'm just delighted. And it's equally a pleasure and a privilege for me to be here tonight facilitating this conversation. We had a chance over dinner to get a sense of these panelists, and they are truly remarkable. And we will have a great encounter even without the high tech that we were hoping to have. An encounter with members of the University of Denver community. And I will say, we've spent all day here, and I was here yesterday and had some time with the chancellor. My impression at this point, it's not empirically verified, but I do get around a bit in higher education to institutions around the country. And it feels to me, from what I've seen so far, that this university has gone as far as anyone I know in embracing Parker's work. So Parker, you are among friends, even though you can't see them. I can guarantee that. And just to say that this is a live encounter, the idea of a live encounter, a concept that originated in Thomas Merton's translation of a poem called The Way of, a poem by Xuan Tzu called The Woodcarver. And Parker's friends, and those of you who follow him, and I see some heads nodding in the audience, know that that story that Parker uses for teaching and in many of his writings, in his hands is a story that poses questions that can quite literally transform lives, the kinds of questions that come out of his reading of The Woodcarver, and has transformed lives, many lives, and mine included. So we're here also this evening to celebrate the inauguration at DU of an innovative, I would even be tempted to say radical, except that might make some people nervous, so maybe I won't. An innovative experiment in faculty conversation and renewal, really a remarkable experiment, drawing directly on methods that were designed and tested at the Center for Courage and Renewal. And holy cow, they're even written into DU's policies of faculty governance. And I want to ask you, Parker, if you ever could have imagined such a thing when you started out your work and decided you needed to be outside of the academy looking in, and now you're being written into the faculty governance. Isn't that an amazing turn of fate? It's great.
Well, I went to school with Thomas Jefferson, so.
Right. Right, after a while, you never do know. So Parker likes to say the Center for Courage and Renewal, which was co-led by Rick Jackson, who's here with us, and his wife Marcy Jackson, and they've been involved forever since its founding. Parker likes to say that its function has been to put wheels on his ideas, so we all understand that that's what the center is doing. So it occurred to me, as we think about what's going on here in this place, with these adventurous folk in the Mile High City, that they are doing Courage and Renewal wheelies and out on the open road, which is really quite remarkable to see. So I can't imagine a better coming together, a more fitting setting for us to celebrate 20 years of the Courage and Renewal, and a wonderful chance to celebrate you, Parker, to celebrate DU, and to celebrate this coming together of these two streams. We have the plan for the evening. We have five panelists, and Rick's a ringer, and Rick and I will play a role here too. All members of this larger community, and they each have been given 8 minutes, sort of an odd number, that's what they've been given, for a conversation with Parker and a chance for them to interrogate Parker and for him to interrogate them, a back and forth conversation. We'll see how well we can do that with the limitations of the technology, but I think we can. And they all have been thinking about how they first engaged Parker's work, The Courage to Teach, or his work, sort of where were they in their lives, and how did it enter their lives, and how has it affected their lives, and how it's still alive for them. And then they're going to ask a question that they're still carrying with them of Parker, and that will be a chance to go back and forth. So it should be really a lot of fun, and something Parker does and does very well. Even though he can't see us, I bet he can continue to do it well. So we're organized in the order in which we're going to do this, and I will introduce each panelist, and then he or she will have his 8 minutes. I'll be a timekeeper to try to keep us on track. So our first interlocutor of Parker Palmer is Roberto Corrada. He is the Mulligan Burleson Chair in Modern Learning and professor in the Sturm College of Law. So kick us off, if you would, please, Roberto.
Hello, Parker. Such a pleasure to be with you, although virtually. I came to your work in about 1999 or 2000. I had recently gotten tenure at the law school and the university, and that had been such a slog. I think as teachers, we just tried to survive that process while we focus on scholarship in order to get tenure. At the end of that process, of course, we should feel like we're now free to become the teachers we were meant to be, but I went in the opposite direction, actually. Right after I got tenure, I sort of became depressed and felt like I wasn't doing anything with my students. I had no impact on my students' lives. They were really intelligent. They came to law school. They read the material. They took the exams, and they moved on. And who was I, in relation to them? And so I was looking for answers, and I came upon The Courage to Teach, which I got to say, I didn't really look at the date that it had been published, and I had this sense that it was this venerable text that had been around since maybe the 50s or something. But I started to read it, and the first part really resonated with me because you were speaking truths things that I had felt and had thought in my own mind about academia that I thought I was afraid to articulate. So the quote earlier on about it being an oasis, it was an oasis for me. Here's my question for you. I have really been guided by, you have two charts in the sort of the middle of the book. You have the myth of knowing and the community of truth. And when I read that, I resolved to try to create communities of truth in my classroom. And I've done that mostly by adopting the simulation method so that the students really can explore things with me and I can be a knower with them. So the question is, to tee up those charts in your book, you actually have this question just before those. It says, imagine yourself in a classroom, you ask a well-framed question, and then you wait and wait as the great silence descends. You know you should not wait some more, not jump in, but your heart pounds, then sinks, and finally feels helpless and out of control. So you answer your own question with an emotional mix of anxiety, anger, and authoritarianism that only makes things worse. And that captures almost all my moments in the classroom. So in creating the community of truth, I try to become a knower with my students. And of course, they're not fooled. They know I'm the teacher, so I'm an experienced knower. And my question to you is, I try to eliminate hierarchy in the classroom as much as possible, but it's a struggle. What advice do you have about that? How can we disappear more and sort of get rid of this idea that we're the teacher and actually be a peer with our students?
Well, thank you, Roberto. What a powerful statement from a good teacher. I very much respect the roots from which your question and your teaching come, which is really about wrestling with yourself and with your students and with what good teaching and learning look like. So, I think for me, the fundamental answer is that we now have decades and decades of research that show that real student learning comes not from listening to lectures, from keeping your head down, taking notes, from the kind of course about which one student said, break a pencil and you miss a century. Real student learning and so when you constantly myself what it is I'm doing with, what it is I'm trying to serve. And if I'm trying to serve student learning, I'm going to back off from giving the answer as often as possible. I'm going to let myself experience anxiety of being in the mud with my students and let them engage the subject with me as mentor and guide. I mean, I think there are obviously moments classroom what you're talking about where the confusion gets so great that the learning starts to get lost. And I think that's a time the teacher can sort of untie the Gordian knot and help get students back on track with a fruitful line of inquiry. But I find that I can do that only if I remember who it is and what it is that I'm there to serve. And I think in many walks of life, that's how we wrestle to get our egos out of the way, because I think a lot of bad teaching comes from protecting your ego, from wanting to look good, which always means forgetting that you're there to serve something bigger than you, and how you're. So, the moment with some bounce back here from the audio, that may be about as far as I can take my answer to a very good
No, just to follow up, as much as I try to sort of diminish the ego in the classroom, and I spend a lot of time working to engage the students in this community of truth that we're trying to build, they foist the teachership stuff on me, right? In other words, even if I submerge in the back of the classroom, I'm just really present as the teacher in their minds. And so it's sort of I guess, I mean, I just try to continue to work at it, and it's you, and you're doing this. But, you know, what about, I mean, they're sort of socially constructed into viewing us in this hierarchical role. And so how do we dissipate that, I guess? You know, you're back.
You know, I think there are some things that you can dissipate at least a little by naming very explicitly the dynamic that you see going on. And I have occasionally said to students, look, I could just sort out all this out by giving the lecture and asking you to take notes and feed it back to me at the end of the term. But if I do that, I'm going to be serving you poorly in terms of what will be expected of you when you get out into the big old world and start working at your profession, be it law or anything else, where you're going to be required to sort things out. You're going to be to think on your feet. You're going to be required to ask questions that haven't yet been asked. It certainly means discovering answers that aren't at the back of the book. So let's just name this dynamic that you're trying to project on me, this role of expertise, and you've been conned by the larger society into thinking that that's what a good teaching looks like. But I'm here to tell you it isn't, and I don't intend to play that game because playing that game would serve you poorly, and I'm here to serve you well. I've always believed that in our society, there's a kind of deprogramming that you have to do with students, and I've often argued that part of orientation for new students or part of Student Parent Day ought to be deprogramming students and parents alike from this notion of good education, sitting down and listening to experts have to say, because in fact, that serves one very poorly in today's rapidly changing economy, job market, the culture, society, et cetera, where so much is up for grabs. So I do think we sometimes, you know, have these mythological or these constructs going that constrain us. And the best thing I know about how to break out of those constructs is to name them with as much clarity as possible, to dissect them, and to tell students why you simply do not believe that falling into those conceptual traps is the best way to serve them well. And you want to serve them well. They may not enjoy it. They may feel they're being cheated, but in fact, they're getting a better deal than they would otherwise. So there are times when I just think we have to have those, you know, have the big discussion about what the invisible barriers are here, and the projections one way or the other that keep us from doing real education.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have the Zoom up, but we're not sure it's stable yet. So we're going to have one more. We're going to go ahead and have one more question with this system, and then hope that we'll move on to the other one as soon as we can. So our next questioner is Jennifer Barty. She's a graduate student in curriculum and instruction at the Morgridge College of Education, and she has a great story and a fascinating question. And I'll put the timer on, but it won't stop. Please go ahead.
Hello, Parker. I had the pleasure of talking to you for a brief moment during your sound check the other day. So I know you can't see me, but I can see you. It's good to see you again. When we were having our dinner, we were discussing how we came to your writings and our own kind of journeys. And I shared that I used to, before I was a PhD student here, I was an elementary music teacher for a long time. And how I found it so natural to connect with my students. The nurturing kind of aspect is easy to find when they're little and cute and energetic and, you know, new to the world. And I found myself in a position of switching to teach undergraduates. And my first semester teaching undergraduates, you know, is very much about survival and figuring out how to write my syllabus and how to formulate my slides and what should be on a test and what shouldn't be on a test. And I lost that nurturing side of me, that part of me that was able to make those emotional connections to my students, because I was so bogged down with just the technicality of my job. And I remember very clearly driving to teach on my first day of the second semester and thinking to myself, okay, like, this isn't okay. I need to make these connections, and I need to open myself up to these, and I need to find that part of myself that I somehow didn't bring into the room with me last semester. And so I just kind of started visualizing, just trying to project love and project appreciation of my students. And the dynamic shift that I felt from that was rather moving and rather invigorating. And it's still challenging on some days, but I found in reading your books, especially the Courage to Teach, an understanding of why that was important to me, what that movement was within me that I didn't have words to put into play or a way to articulate or explain to anyone else. And I think my question for you is, as a curriculum and instruction student, someone who's looking to hopefully work with future teachers, aside from helping them find their own courage to teach, are there any words of wisdom you might be able to gift or ideas to me that my students can help their future students find a courage to learn, to find a courage to be authentically in the room with them, and to, even if they're younger and they don't really know who their authentic self is fully developed yet, but how to help them connect to who that is and to be present in the room and ready to learn as a partner.
Mm-hmm. And Jen, what student do you have in mind?
I think, I mean, personally, I work with college students, but what I'm hoping is to help teachers establish that with their little ones, with elementary school students, so they can take that learning with them as they go through life and engage with education in a different way.
Well, you would know better than I, but I've heard so many teachers say that you know, when young kids first come into classrooms, they have all the qualities that you're talking about. They're curious, they're interested, they want to find out, they want to learn, they're excited, they're observant. I was reading just the other day about a program that probably many of you know about. It was new to me. I first heard it on NPR, that develops empathy in young children by having a young mother and a little baby, maybe a 6-month-old or a 12-month-old or an 18-month-old child, come into the classroom once a week. And the baby becomes the empathy teacher for these young children, because children respond to an infant, and the teacher gets them talking about how the child is responding to them and how curious the child is and what makes the child smile and what makes the child frown and what makes the child cry, and they learn empathy that way. But what really struck me about that was how curious kids are about something as common, child, you know, 5, 6, 7 years younger than and the first time we schooling kind of knocked that curiosity out of them. So I guess there's a part of me that wonders, so what's the boundary they cross, into what grade, when that curiosity has died off because of the strictures of schooling itself. And if you know, you're in a better position maybe to identify that zone of transition than I am, and I would think that what the grown-ups need to do is to figure out a way that kids don't have to cross through barriers that or checkpoints that where they get the curiosity drummed out of them. I'm not so sure it's something that needs to be taught as much as something that needs to be protected. Does that make sense to you? You have more experience with this than I do.
No, that does make a lot of sense to me. I guess just to kind of follow through with that, how can you impart on a new teacher or a pre-service teacher the importance of that role, of the power that they can wield at that moment where that transition might happen, to be cognizant of that and not to be, you know, so caught where I was, you know, with the technicalities and the lesson plans and the grades and figuring out report cards and everything, that they kill that spirit accidentally.
Yeah. One of the experiences we've had constantly in our Courage to Teach programs since the early 90s, we've been at this, I guess, 25 years now, is that by asking teachers, even more experienced teachers than the ones you're talking about, to do storytelling about their own lives, autobiographical reflection, and asking questions that actually take them back to those moments when they sort of instinctively operated with beginner's mind, and then to think, to reflect on where they started to lose that, where their gut started to tighten up when they went to school, instead of going to school with excitement and interest and curiosity, they started going to school with a certain level of fear about, you know, losing out in competition or feeling stupid or whatever, wherever that fear. But by finding teachers that journey and asking them where they lost those birthright gifts, capacity to bring us into the world as natural learners, we did more to help them recapture a desire to do that for the students they were working with than any kind of instructional stuff we could have done about, you know, the importance of recapturing early childhood curiosity. In other words, our own stories of our own learning journeys, I think, are the most powerful sources of encouragement to change. But I think second, and again, you professionals, education, I'm really not. I'm just a guy who writes about stuff.
Well, I think we'll go along through our panel, and then we'll circle back if we have time for the. As we took our break, our two first panelists said we took one for the team as we're coming up on this much better system. So I think we'll circle back, give them another couple of minutes if we still have time. But let's move on. There he is. Can you hear me? No.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, I just wanted to do a second piece with Jen's question.
Okay. Okay.
Is Jen right?
Jen's right. She's.
Hi, Parker. I'm sorry they took my microphone away from me. I don't know what happened.
You can't hear it.
Sorry, Parker. Okay, I think I almost have two. I have two microphones. Okay. Hi, thank you.
Thank you. So they've taken my microphone away many times. Always for good reason. So the second thing I wanted to say, Jen, in response to your question, so the autobiographical piece that we've used in Courage to Teach retreats, which helps teachers recover their own story as learners, which I think is one of the most powerful motivators to, you know, either replicate their story or make it different for the kids that they're working with. That's the individual piece, but there's a communal piece too. And that has to do with helping people really come into this notion of the teacher as leader. And that means learning how to organize to begin to change or lean on those institutional barriers that create bad learning circumstances for children, that beat the curiosity out of them by the time they're in what, I don't know, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, somewhere in there. They stop being curious and start being afraid. And I think it takes, I've often thought that all forms of professional education should, from education to medicine to law, should teach students some of the skills and sensibilities of community organizers. Because community organizers actually have a skill set and a knowledge bank around what it takes to affect institutional change. And I did a piece for Change Magazine from the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching a few years back, in which I made this argument about teaching elements of community organizing in all forms of professional education. So I think it's a two-track approach to, recover your own story as a learner, and then to know something about organizing, coming together with other teachers to create systemic transformation.
Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Parker. All right, so we now move on to our third panelist, Frank Truitt, who's Senior Advisor to the Chancellor and Provost for Diversity and Inclusion. And Frank, as is true of all the panelists, has a very interesting story of his live encounters with your work, and now he gets to have a virtual live encounter with your person. Frank, take it away.
Hi, Parker. How are you?
Hi, Frank. I'm well. And you, sir? How are you?
Doing well. So I went over to the dark side on administration about 6 years ago. But prior to that, spent plenty of time in the classroom teaching future higher ed professionals and researchers. And what's interesting about that story is that I never intended to be a professor, never intended to be a teacher. And halfway through my doc program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, I landed on a dissertation topic that had me thinking about what are the best ways to create inclusive learning environments for African American graduate students in particular. And that was born out of my own experience. And so in preparation for tonight, I went back and looked at that document and saw that you were cited 12 times in my dissertation. So you have been with me from the beginning of my journey in terms of trying to figure out how to create inclusive learning environments. The title of the dissertation was Black Souls in the Ivory Tower, Understanding What It Means to Teach in a Manner That Respects and Cares for the Souls of African American Graduate Students. And I was really invested in trying to figure out how to create learning environments that allowed students to not, particularly minoritized students, to not have to lose a sense of who they are as they engaged in learning. And so I got away from that for a little while, but much of your work directed me to the need to show up fully in the classroom, to show up as my authentic self in all that I am. And so fast forward 15 years later, maybe a little bit more, and the last publication that I just finished with two of my former students from here really took a look at how we could transform traditionally white institutions, classrooms in particular, into ways that they allowed for Black lives to matter. And so given all that's been happening in the country and the work around really courageous students advocating for new ways of creating engaging learning, I thought it was important to return to that work. My question for you is, the courage to teach is really important in getting us to show up as our full authentic self in a learning environment. I think the piece that's always been hard for me as I connect your work is how do we show up as our full racial selves in the classroom? So the question is, how do we get instructors, and if we think about both K-12 and higher ed educational environments, the instructors are 80%, somewhere between 78 to 80% white in both of those domains, right? How do we get the majority of those instructors to show up, to have the courage to show up as their full, authentic self that engages and embraces their racial beings?
Well, I said that I know what it's like to show up in a white body with two desires very much alive inside of me. One is to feel at home in my own skin, which I think is a desire every human being has. And the other is to feel at home on the face of a very diverse planet, and not to run scared in the midst of that diversity. And I think that a lot of us have our own version of running scared in the midst of diversity from different angles for different reasons. My best guess as to what I could do and have done at times, when I've been fortunate enough to have a partner, is if I can have, as a teaching partner, a dialogue partner in a classroom, a person of color, and we can have an honest conversation in front of our students about what it is like to live inside our own skins and to work together as colleagues, we can model something that students can begin to trust. They can begin to trust some of their own desires and instincts in that context. I think we all know that, I mean, let me give you a personal example. I'm at a conference in New York, which is about 80% people of color. So for one of the rare times in my life, I'm in the distinct racial minority. I will also be on stage at this conference in dialogue with a person of color. And I am acutely aware in this context of what it must be like to be a person of color in a predominantly white setting. I think that's an experience that every white person needs to have to at least begin to develop the sensibilities of how unsafe it can feel to students of color to be in what we white people take for granted as a safe and secure environment. These are, I'm a work in progress on this. The one thing I want to say for sure is your dissertation needs to be a book. Black hole in the ivory tower, we really need to hear that testimony, that insight today. The other thing I want to say is that a piece of the Courage to Teach, which I'm always glad that I wrote about, is the tendency in higher education, and it's a very strong tendency, to want the big story of the disciplines to replace this little story of the student. And I see that as deformative education. So the drive in higher education, certainly when I went on through a doctoral program, was a diminishment of self. Even my white, straight, male, affluent self, a diminishment of self, and a replacement of that with the big story of the discipline that my professors wanted me to learn. As if the idea of education was to overwhelm my little inadequate, biased, narrow, pinched view of life with the objective truth articulated by the discipline. And, I was in enormous pain through most of my graduate education for that reason. And I have to imagine that pain is deeper and more threatening and more existential for students of color. At least the big story I was being given was a white European story and largely male dominated. And so I suppose I should have felt at home with it, but I didn't, because it wasn't helping meet one of my desires, which was to feel at home on the face of a very diverse earth. I think these are things that white scholars and white teachers need to think about, and I think the only way to step toward them or into them is in partnership with peers of color in the academy. I know that those circumstances are not always easily achieved and sometimes not achieved at all, but I don't know of any other way to move forward in the kinds of settings that mostly dominate higher education. I'm betting you have other ideas, and I'd love to know what they are.
Thank you. The only follow-up I'll say is that I think we have an opportunity, particularly those of us who have the privilege of training future instructors, whether that's at the K-12 or higher ed level, to at least model exactly what you just talked about and attempt to create those opportunities for that kind of engagement and learning environment. I'm not sure we do that consistently enough across the various programs that produce our future teachers.
Yeah, I would just say that if you and I could partner and them, hard won of our own, but it's possible to find ground on which to stand, in which we don't give up our own identity, but we actually invite each other's identity to show up more fully. And honestly, I think we would be making a great contribution to their lives as future teachers.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, thank you so much, Frank, for that question and for your work. So our next question comes, and insight comes from Virginia Pitts. Her title is Director of University Teaching. I love that title. It sort of gives her a big field. She has a story about her encounters with your work, Parker, and a question. So thank you, Virginia.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Parker, for being here. I don't remember the first book of yours that I read, but the one that had the greatest impact upon me, I was sharing this earlier, was A Hidden Wholeness. So I came across that book when I was in graduate school, and it was 10 years ago, when I was interviewing teachers and school leaders in schools across Chicago, and I'd spend an hour or 90 minutes of their time asking them questions about their work, and at the end of that time I would always say, thank you so much for your time. And they would say, no, thank you so much for listening. And it was at that time that I realized the need for some sort of support work for teachers around the emotional and the relational labor of doing that work of teaching. So your book, Hidden Wholeness, really resonated with me, and it was the first time I had come across a model of what it means to create these spaces where we can all show up as our whole authentic selves. And at that time, I don't know if you will remember this, you probably won't, it was 10 years ago. A mutual friend connected us, and we actually had a conversation about that work. And it was through that conversation and through your other books that I came to connect with the work that we do in Denver around Courage and Renewal, and had the chance to sit in these circles of trust where I got to learn what it's like to be in a space where you can show up as your whole authentic self. And that work has continued to inform my work here. I get to facilitate groups of teachers, learning communities, if you will. And I think it's because of that work that people will often say to me that these learning communities feel like support groups. So here's what's been on my mind lately. You talk about this notion of the tragic gap, a tragic gap between what is and what we believe can be. And this is kind of shifting this out of the classroom, but we've talked a lot about hierarchy and ego and fear, and of course that doesn't go away when we leave the classroom. So in this higher education context that we're all in, I've been paying attention to that tragic gap between the ways in which we often interact with each other in these higher ed spaces, and between the ways in which we interacted in these circles of trust, where we showed up as our whole authentic selves. And that whole authentic self, as you talk about in the courage work, the courage to teach, is so important for learning to take place, especially if we're learning from each other in community. And given everything that's happening in the broader context now, it seems so important that we learn to learn with each other in community. So all that to say, the question on my mind now is how, in this higher ed context, where there is so much emphasis on status, where our egos can get triggered so easily, including mine when I got invited to be on this panel, and at first my ego just exploded to think I was going to be on a panel with all of these people, in front of all of these people. And then I saw who else was going to be on the panel, and I thought, oh boy, I'm in over my head. And my ego diminished, so it goes up and down like that. But yeah, so my question is, how can we work in these spaces, show up as our authentic selves, when there are so many things around here that get in the way of our interacting with each other authentically?
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you very much. Did I get your name right, Virginia?
Virginia is correct, yes.
Thank you. Well, the first thing I want to say is, get old. That really helps. I turned 79 recently, and what matters just doesn't matter anymore. Because when you get old, you realize the next step is to get dead. A lot of stuff just doesn't count at that point in time. I love being old. I just finished writing a book about being old. I really, really love it. For the reasons I just named, it sort of relativizes so much stuff that one of my favorite lines in the book is, old is just another word for nothing left to lose. So get out there and take some risks for the common good. The reason I turned towards this notion of the tragic gap, and I have worked it so hard in my own life. I mean, everything I've ever written is about my own struggles, right? And I've tried to be honest in the books about that. The reason is that I'm really interested in being persistent with the things I care about. And if I don't recognize that the things I care about are not going to be achieved in my lifetime, because they all mean taking one step after the other in the tragic gap, then I'm going to stop caring about them. And I care a lot about how fraudulent it is to let myself or our relationships or a whole institution be driven by such surfacey things as status, such nonsensical things as status, such flimsy, thin, against the darkness protections as status. I mean, 30 seconds of reflecting deeply on it proves how flimsy and thin that is to ward off any of life's great challenges. But so it means that the tragic gap, as I've often said, isn't just the difference between what is and what could be is sad, but it's inevitable. It's tragic in the Greek sense, it's tragic in the biblical sense, it's tragic in the Shakespearean sense. And unfortunately, these are subjects we don't teach much anymore in wide swaths of our educational system. And so people grow up with a sense that, well, if they have enough skill and enough knowledge, they can solve any problem on the face of the earth. That's the American way. That's the American hubris. That's the American overweening ego. That's what leads us to want to make America great again. And when we ought to be asking, when was it great? I mean, was it great when the first slave ships landed on these shores? A century and more before the Declaration of Independence? Was it great during the Civil War? Was it great during Jim Crow? Was it great during the new Jim Crow, which Michelle Alexander has pointed us to? This is about the tragic gap, and we delude ourselves to think that there's some sort of golden age which we have to recover. That very delusion is a fear response to the fact that we aren't perfect, and for all the screw-ups of the founders of this country, they at least had the wisdom to establish a system that allowed us to correct some of their mistakes. you know, for them, all men are created equal. Men who owned property who were white and nobody else. And yet they created a system that allowed us to prove that their view was inadequate to the establishment of a true democracy. And so they had a sense of the tragic gap and of creating a tension holding system that, if we care for it, would persist through time. And we need to care for it vigorously right now, because a lot of its tension holding capacity is being eroded by systematic attacks on the press, systematic attacks on the courts, systematic attacks on the value of diversity, and as we grow more diverse by the day. And so the tragic gap notion for me is a way of maintaining persistence around things that won't be achieved in my lifetime. And it takes me, of course, to these, what for me are fundamental notions about I have to stop worrying so much about being effective. I don't ever want to stop worrying about being, but I have to have a standard that sees that as I won't die being able to say, I'm sure glad I gave my life to this or that, because now everyone can check it off their to-do list. You know, no one who has ever aspired to live by high values has been able to say that. Instead, I need to learn to live by a standard of faithfulness, of showing up as best I know how, in the moment, with the best gifts I have to offer and my best awareness of the problems that are within my reach where I want to offer those gifts. That's what I call faithfulness. And that's kind of the standard that I've been using. So I appreciate you bringing the tragic gap concept into the conversation, because I think it has a lot to do with being in all of the things we're talking about for the long haul. And that's what we need, is we need people. You know, I spent the 60s in Berkeley getting my PhD, and I was formed, or one might say deformed, by a movement that really somehow believed that by the end of the 60s, it was going to change everything that needed changing. And when that didn't happen, a lot of people, a lot of my peers in the 60s decided, oh, heck with it, I'll go to work on Wall Street and, you know, get the biggest slice of the pie I can get my hands on. I didn't want to live that kind of life, and so I had to develop and work hard to develop frameworks that will allow me to do something more sustainable around the values that I thought were worth living for and dying while still holding in hand.
Thank you so much for that.
Yes, thank you so much for that. Bless you for that. So we have one more interlocutor, and we have 10 minutes, so we're in good shape. Paolo Adamo is a teaching associate professor of Spanish. He's also working on a doctorate in education. And she's batting cleanup here, and she's the perfect person to do it. So Paolo, take it away.
Hi, Parker. Do you hear me? Yeah.
Hi, Paolo. Yes, I can.
Great. So I think I'm a teacher, even though I never taught K through 12. I've taught college for half of my life. And I always thought that it was the most valuable profession. But since I started teaching, I've been trying to be moved towards most prestigious ranks. So it's very aligned with Virginia's question of doing some sort of different type of work, like research and literature and things like that. I was like, no, but this is great. I think there is so much value in teaching college and doing it well. And I've been at the U for a long time, and the first time I ever read one of your books was by Paul Michael, I think, who in Philosophy of Education said, like, I think by the way you're talking and thinking, you would like Parker Palmer's work, and I loved it. And I think it's to know as we're known. Yeah. And I love the idea of your gift and bring your authentic self to the classroom, because I think it was very validating to me to know that it was okay to do that, that I didn't have to sneak it in, that it was the right thing to do. So over this last few years, I think I've worked really hard to bring my authentic self, and I think it has certainly made me a much better instructor, and it's much easier simply because it's me all along. So I feel I'm comfortable in the classroom and in my own office, but I do not work in the College of Education. I work in languages and literatures. So I feel like once I step outside my very comfort zone, or I'm not talking with very alike minds, it's really strong current that brings you down. So my question to you is how to remain strong and hopeful swimming upstream against a very strong current. Do you just look for peers to hold you, or you keep swimming up and fighting?
Well, what a wonderful question. My goodness. And so you're sitting in a semicircle there with two friends, Rick Jackson and Diana Chapman Walsh, who have helped me swim up many a time by swimming with me. So yes, indeed, friends and colleagues, people who share your values. I'll put it this way: people who are as crazy as you are. You need crazy people like that to hang out with and make you feel less crazy. So you can actually look out at the world and say, you know what? It's not us that's crazy, it's them. and then try to help make a few more people sane. I learned something from my wife has been on the big 10-day rafting trip down the Colorado River through Grand Canyon 10 times. I've only been 3. She's a more courageous person that way than I am. But I learned something on the river. That river has a very strong current, and you don't dare try to swim against it. You just won't make it. But one of the things a good boatman knows is that if you get over to the side of that river, there's a backwater, I'm not quite sure how they, backflow that is actually created by hydrodynamics that will take you back upstream, slowly but surely. So if a boatman overshoots a good camping spot for the night, you get off to the side, and suddenly the river itself, through hydrodynamics, is taking you back up to where you want to go, that you may be overshot by 50 or 100 feet. I think that's a very interesting metaphor. That, again, I think sometimes our concerns about status keep us in the mainstream where the current is very, very strong. But if we get off to the side, where we aren't, in the big show, where we sometimes think we should be, we can go back upstream and practice our own forms of subtle resistance against a current that we think is moving in the wrong direction. And I think there are all kinds of ways to get off to the side in our institutions. Ally yourself with marginalized students or marginalized faculty members. Ally yourself with people who share your values. And you have to consciously and intentionally look for them. One of the things that a story that I like to tell often when I used to do a lot of speaking on college campuses was that if I were there for 3 days of lecturing about the kind of pedagogy represented by the Courage to Teach, at the end of the first lecture with 300 people, some one person would come up to me and say, you know, Dr. Palmer, I really love what you had to say tonight, but I'm the only one in this university who believes what you believe. You know, it's just you and me against the masses. And of course, you feel so welcome that I have one friend here. Isn't that great? I got 2 more lectures to do. You give the second lecture, and 3 or 4 people would come up individually to me and say the same thing. You know, I love what you said tonight, but I'm the only person here who believes that. And by the 3rd lecture, there were 6 or 7 people coming up and saying the same thing. And I started to realize that my job went beyond giving those lectures. It extended to getting those people together, introducing them to one another, and helping to form these little communities of resistance, which again I regard as, you know, one of the arts and skills of a community organizer. Which, you know, if you're a good community organizer, and I spent just 5 years early in my life trying to be a good community organizer, and you've got a problem with City Hall, you don't go to the mayor to solve it. You go to the grandmothers who are doing the heavy lifting in the neighborhood. We're taking care of the kids, and we're trying to create those safety zones that people need to live more secure lives. You learn that the grandmothers have a kind of that's that backstream flow along the edge, you know, out of the main action, and you organize them, and you start getting results. You resource them, you provide for them, and you support each other. But in order to do that in a big institution, you have to find ways to raise your flag, and you have to say, here's what I value, here's what I care about. Is there anybody here who shares these values and concerns with me? And bit by bit, bring together a group of people who at very least can support each other and keep each other from feeling crazy. And at best, can actually organize to help create systemic or organizational change. That's my experience. I don't think you can swim alone. But you can't, nor can you Google support group. Some things that are ungoogleable. And so you have to raise your flag and try to find those people on your own. So I just encourage you to do that, and I thank you for reclaiming your vocation as a teacher. I think it's ever so important.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Parker. So you've done it again, by the way. You said you used to go on campuses and you point out to people that they had companions on the journey that they didn't know about, and what you've brought us together here at DU. You've brought all these good people together to be companions on the journey, and having given each one of them a beautiful piece of succinct advice, dissipate the sense of hierarchy by naming what's going on, help students recover their own stories as learners and train them all in community organizing, teach with someone like Frank, you and Frank. I'd love the image of the two of you in the classroom modeling a different way that all of us can become comfortable in our own skins and feel safe in a diverse world. What a beautiful image. Get old, Virginia, you need to get old. I love that. And then you won't care anymore. But this idea of the tragic gap as the tragic gap notion is really a commitment to understand that we need to persist working on things that will not be solved in our lifetimes. You and I are old, but some of them are quite young, and yet still they'll have to face that tragedy too. And then how to swim upstream, you have to find other crazy people and get off to this side of the river and paddle like crazy back up the river. So I want to give Rick Jackson, your dear friend and companion, the last word. So Rick, do you have a working microphone or do you want mine?
Hi, Park. We know you're in New York, but you've also very much been with us here today. Our good long-term friend, Paul Michalek, who's been here on the campus for 14 years, has been a Johnny Appleseed fellow about this work for quite a while. He now has a Jane Appleseed colleague in Kate Willick. I think there are reasons to be encouraged in this institution. I'd like to say hopeful, but the context of all of our conversation, I think, gives us pause about how it can be easy to use the word hope, but in dark times we need to be careful about that. But we can use words like encouraged. Encouragement is something we can provide to each other. And I know Diana and I have been very encouraged by first of all, the reception that we've received, the hospitality, the welcome into community, and the meeting of new friends, as Diana was saying. I'd actually like to invite you, because your comments were really, I think, poised to go ahead and say one more thing that might be good counsel for this community as it begins to take some fairly concrete steps, such as inviting faculty to do their peer reviews in different ways. And we actually practiced that this afternoon with open, honest questions and what it might mean to listen without trying to fix somebody or advise them, but to help them sort through some of their own deep questions. How doing that kind of work might actually be the seedbed for a movement of change that, as you said, might take a lot longer than a 3, 5, or even 50-year plan, but nevertheless might bear fruit. And I know you've thought about a movement sensibility or a movement ways of thinking about change, and you've been a bit of a student on social movements, kind of alluded to that with some of your remarks. But I think before we break, if you would be willing to share just a few words of counsel about how we might view the work, how our colleagues here at Denver University might view the work that they're about as a movement.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. Good to see you again. Good to see Diana. And it's good to be seen now that we have.
To see and to be seen.
That actually takes me where I want to go. You know, things can get so complicated in some of our institutional cultures, and just in terms of how we think about each other, how we think about the mission. I like to simplify as much as I possibly can, remembering the words as I recollect from Justice Brandeis. I may have that wrong, but whoever it was that wisely said, "For the simplicity that lies this side of complexity, I would not give a fig, but for the simplicity that lies the other side of complexity, I would give my life." I love this notion that there is a simplicity on the other side of complexity. Academic culture complexifies things, and the simplicity I want to name in response to your question is that one of the deepest yearnings in every human soul, whether you never got any farther than the 3rd grade or you have 5 PhDs, is to be seen and heard as who you are and for who you are. And we spend so little time seeing and hearing each other in the way that happens when you gather in a small circle to ask honest, open questions that allow, that do something that Nell Morton, the great feminist theologian, called hearing each other into speech, hearing each other into deeper and deeper speech. You know, I once talked to the head of the psychiatric department, psychological services department at a major university, which shall go unnamed, except that it's in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I said, so you see a lot of students? And he said, yes, and named various problems. I said, do you also see faculty? And he said, oh, yes, absolutely. We have off-campus facilities where faculty can meet safely with us. I said, what's the major presenting problem? He said, oh, that's easy, a sense of fraudulence. A sense that if anybody knew how dumb they were, they'd throw them out. A sense that I don't belong here. And so, you know, in academia, and there are certainly exceptions to this, and DU may well be one, but across a lot of academia, we've created a culture where most people feel they don't belong. And that means they don't feel seen and heard. And so the first step in a movement is to not only see and hear someone at the level of soul, of identity and integrity, whatever you want to call it, but is to allow them to see themselves that way. That's what honest, open questions do. People, we've seen it, Rick, you and I have seen it. Diana has seen it. All of us who've shared in these processes have seen it. We've seen people come to moments of self-recognition. Oh, that's what I truly believe. That's the rock on which I stand. That's true north for me. And once you've seen that, it's really hard to get the toothpaste. You know, you have to follow. You have to honor what you have heard from inside yourself about what you truly value and what you truly desire for yourself, your students, your partner, your friends, your society, your whole body politic. And that's where movements start. They start when people get in touch with what they most profoundly value, and then decide that they're not going to yield on that value, come hell or high water, because to do so would be to live a fraudulent life. So in the midst of a culture that makes people feel fraudulent, let's do those simple things that make them feel real. And when people start feeling real, that is the personal foundation of social change. And I could go on and on about the movement model, but I just want to identify that point of ignition, that when a person has claimed their authentic selfhood and done it in a way that has been evoked by people who listen and people who see and who in that sense want to make a deep bow to the human soul, then I think you have the ignition point of change. Obviously, there's a lot more to say about getting organized, or, you know, raising the flag, coming together, small groups getting organized, etc. But your remarks, Rick, just triggered in me the sense that we have to go back to the simplicity that lies on the other side of complexity and remember what it is that every human being needs. And the more we can offer that to each other, the more authenticity is going to come not only into our personal lives, but into our collective lives.
Parker, thank you so very much. We've kept you up beyond your Quaker bedtime by a little bit. So.
Yeah, they're going to kick me out for this.
Right, you're going to be eldered out, right? But we're just so grateful to you for dealing with all of this complexity on the far side of simplicity and hanging in there, because you really have accomplished what we hoped to accomplish when we thought everything was just going to go very smoothly, which is we have had a beautiful live encounter with you and with your beautiful mind and your beautiful heart and your beautiful soul, and it's been a wonderful privilege for us. We love you so very much, so I think you better go to bed, and thank you.